This is Going Underground. I'm Afshin Rattansi. Coming up in the show, British warplanes continue to bomb ISIS, but have we got enough money for the war? And the brother of a convicted terrorist tells us about radicalization in Britain. Plus, who's winning in the Home Office's fight against the £200 trillion fraud at the heart of capitalism? All this and more coming up on today's Going Underground. Before all that, you'll remember that we covered the bankrolling of the shadow business secretary Chuka Umunna by scandal-hit accountancy firm PwC. From the AIG scandal to Tesco's missing £250 million to its role in our having to bail out RBS, PwC is a force to be reckoned with. Since our report, the multi-billion-pound company gave Going Underground a statement which makes interesting reading. PwC says this about their relations with our main political parties. We do not develop policy on their behalf. Areas of assistance may include observations on the improvement of legislation or proposed legislation. No wonder Labour accepts non-cash contributions from the company. What shadow minister wouldn't want assistance in improving the way laws are to be drafted in Parliament? Albeit that those observations may favour one class to another, given PwC helps the rich dodge taxes. But how come David Cameron doesn't get as much so-called help from PwC? After all, no fewer than 9 members of Ed Miliband's team have been getting free help from the company. There's the shadow business secretary, of course, Chuka Umunna, but also Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls. Then there's Shadow International Development Secretary Jim Murphy and Shadow Climate Change Secretary Caroline Flint. Also the Skills Secretary Liam Byrne, who knows all about PwC because he was a Chief Secretary to the Treasury under Gordon Brown. Then there's Shadow Justice Minister David Hanson, let alone former Shadow Business Secretary John Denham, and another of Gordon Brown's finance ministers, Stephen Timms. Oh, and Angela Eagle, the current shadow leader of the House of Commons. Why not more Tories? Well, PwC says, over the years, we have supported requests from each of the main political parties. Throughout this period, the trend has been that we have provided more hours to the opposition parties as they have less support infrastructure. So, it's not because PwC think their private polling shows that the Tories will lose the next general election. It's merely because opposition parties need more of their help. The government has U-turned on proposed cuts to the RAF, so the tornadoes that have this week been bombing Iraq won't be sold for scrap anytime soon. So how come we can afford war in what David Cameron has called an age of austerity? Joining me is defence and security writer Richard Norton-Taylor. Richard, welcome back to Going Underground. So you've written recently that bombing ISIS, it's futile.
It's no certainty that you can find the targets. It's expensive. And as everybody says, in the end of the day, you either have ground troops or you've got to even talk to these people. If you're running around in trucks, convoys, individual trucks. Now, I think it seems that the Americans have bombing in Syria, maybe some sort of infrastructure or solid targets like some oil depots. But the British, of course, haven't agreed yet, or the British Parliament, to go into Syria or to bomb Syrian targets. In northern Iraq and Iraq, it's very, very difficult. You can do here and there. They have what they call targets of opportunity, because there are more and more, I suppose, accurate missiles, including one the British have.
So do you think there's widespread acceptance of what you're saying as compared to, say, Michael Fallon there with the Storm Shadow, one of Britain's more expensive missiles? Do you think there's a mismatch between, say, what Fallon thinks and what the British forces
Michael Fallon, his defence secretary, his job is to actually sort of encourage the morale of the British Armed Forces, or at least the only people who are now involved at the moment are the British RAF pilots based in Akrotiri, fortunately, because the British don't have an aircraft carrier like the Americans, so we've got Akrotiri on the sovereign base area in Cyprus. Now, he's got to keep the morale up of those people, but even he and the government, David Cameron, have been quite clear this time. It says that there's going to be a long, generational war, as Cameron puts it, implications for financially for the British defence budget too, for that matter, other Western defence budgets too. What kind of weapons they're going to have for this generational war. But anyway, the British ministers have been sort of emphasising that, you know, not only military action is not can't solve the problem, in my view, it's symbolic, isn't it? I mean, the British public, especially with the hostage questions, and Barack Obama was pretty reluctant to do it, but the political pressure is symbolic.
But there's no talk
and Americans
of the budget.
do it more easily. But
there's no particular talk of the budget. So 36 billion is the 2015, 2016 budget. They've already announced a reprieve of the tornadoes.
They did.
That's something to do with the missiles.
That the tornadoes, a lot of them are 30 years old, but they spend a lot of money on them already, so they can take new. They've got a good radar systems. They've got a kind of radar. Infrared system,
but they were all
designed by the
Israelis. But they were all going to go for the scrap heap.
They were going to go to the scrap heap. They reprieved one squadron of tornadoes, which were about to be axed next year. The Typhoon, the most modern British RAF plane, the Eurofighter Typhoon, which we've been selling to the Saudis and others, trying to get some money for them, they can still not use the most accurate, the Brimstone missile, which is of all
the parts
the most
don't
appropriate
fit.
one.
So we bought a new.
They can't put them on. They've got to adapt the Typhoon yet again. The Typhoon aeroplane was actually designed as an air defense or dogfight fighter for the Cold War in the 80s to fight over the North German planes.
Well, that's going to be useful then.
Against Russian fighters and so on. But at the moment, they'll probably spend more money using the to adapt the Typhoon even more, spend even more money. But to what effect? It's political, symbolic, I suggest. But what's going to happen doesn't necessarily mean special forces on the ground. Everyone says must have American general, former British generals, got to have ground forces somewhere. Whose ground forces is the question. You can't have after Afghanistan and the early wars in Iraq. You can't have British or any Western army, I don't think, in big formations. Special forces, yes. People training the Iraqis and so on, yes, but not anything like it.
Well, they've ruled it out, haven't they?
They've ruled it out. Politically, you can't do that, yeah.
So the 1% real terms increase in the defence budget that Cameron suggested.
In the defence equipment budget
right.
only, which is quite important because for a couple more years, in the next spending review starting next year, 1% in real terms increase. But you don't ring fence the rest of the defence budget. And of course, one of the most expensive items is personnel. Already the Navy is short of personnel. They can't even hardly run one aircraft carrier, let alone two. Well, they won't be ready for a few years yet anyway. But also the Army is going to be cut, I think, more, or threatened to be cut much more because, as I say, I think a British Army, I've said this before, I don't know about other parts of the world or the Russian Army, but certainly the British and the Western armies are going through a kind of existential crisis. Where are they going to be used again after Afghanistan? Which is the enemy?
With everything
ISIS, Taliban.
With everything being focused then on Trident.
Well,
which obviously wouldn't help against ISIS.
I try to get onto nuclear weapons. It's another thing too. But that's a political decision. You write the question: are you going to use Trident? It's even less relevant. Cold War, mutual assured destruction. Fair enough. You can understand it. America, Russia, China. But with France and Britain, are they ever going to, why spend all this money on that? You've got to have intelligence gathering methods, cyber stuff, special forces maybe, more sophisticated ways, and of course diplomatic and economic help and all that for the enemy now, ISIS types.
And they're cutting foreign officers.
And other future groups who are going to be, these guerrilla groups, Taliban or whatever.
So all these companies are making quite a lot of money out of this bizarre procurement process. Anyone ever going to take responsibility for all these procurement decisions? Well,
the other aspect is the Labour Party, Labour opposition here. It's a question of jobs. People tell me, generals, even, defence chiefs here, a lot of these programs are job creation programs. They're 2 aircraft carriers, all built in different dockyards, but assembled in Scotland. The new generation of, Trident, of course, its only bases in Scotland. Barrow, it's a job creation program.
So if we fire one of these missiles, we'd be firing the Storm Shadow missiles, which cost 800,000, something like that.
Yeah, that costs, yeah.
We'd be firing it from a submarine. And is it true?
No, the submarine is not. Storm Shadow is from the aeroplane.
Oh, right, yeah.
From an aeroplane from tornadoes too, which you can fire. The aeroplane can stand back, or fly back, because the Storm Shadow goes well ahead of it.
So what is the reason the aircraft
carriers... Tomahawk Crew, just to interrupt, sorry, the Tomahawk Crew submarines, the Americans have them now, ship-based. The British have a submarine somewhere in the Gulf which could fire Tomahawk cruise missiles. Sorry.
And we spent a fortune on these aircraft carriers. Is it any truth to this allegation that they've changed the names in the MOD literature to delivery systems because they don't have the aircraft to put on the aircraft carriers? Because shouldn't they be in the Persian Gulf?
Yeah, well, they're not ready yet anyway. I mean, HMS Queen Elizabeth, yeah, she launched with whiskey, not with champagne, in the Scottish shipyard in July. HMS Prince of Wales is coming up in a few years' time. Now, they're meant to have American Joint Strike Fighters, F-35s, very expensive, got serious problems, which the Americans acknowledge. To be fair to the Americans, they're open about these things, you know, software problems, they're very heavy. And the price is escalating. They could cost, you know, for 100 million each. Now, originally the British were going to have 100 or so, and then 80 or so. Now they've only confirmed ordered 14, far fewer than the old aircraft carriers and the Harriers of the past. But of course, the Navy says we need aircraft carriers because they fly the flag and the trade routes and their sort of diplomatic presence if they're there. But also they can put commandos on there, which is true. Drones on the decks, and helicopters.
And all this is happening in this context of austerity on a wider level. Is that why we don't hear about the companies so much?
I said, you can say it, why in the Labour Party conference, an opposition party, didn't mention defence really once, I don't think. The Conservative Party didn't really either. They announced some 3 billion worth of contracts for Navy dockyards, but of course it's not new money. If they didn't have that 3 billion quid, all the ships would be in dock all the time because you couldn't repair them. So that's sort of irrelevant in the sense of not new investment. And so, yeah, people don't talk about it, but there's going to be a tremendous crunch after the next election in May next year, 2015 in Britain. Then they're going to have a new defence review next year, promised. What's going to happen then? They're going to say, we're going to ring-fence health, NHS, they've already said, probably... well, welfare is going to be cut. Is foreign aid going to be cut? You know, probably is actually, although you know it's now down for increase. But it's going to be very, very difficult to ring fence or even ring fence, let alone increase the British defence budget. I think that the British defence budget is skewed. That's my personal view. It's skewed. You're spending money on things you don't need. And you've got to look ahead at the future of military conflicts, the kind of enemy you have, how do you actually solve these conflicts, all sorts of different ways, you know, diplomatic, political, you know, maybe with aid, economic, and stop your own extremists in every country, you know, the world.
Richard Norton-Taylor, thank you very much. Coming up after the break, how do Wahhabi militants recruit in Britain? And how long before we all die? 3 weeks, according to our deluded British newspapers. All this and more in part 2 of Going Underground. Our mature British newspapers are ever careful not to over-terrify readers about the calamities that await us. Take this from Yevgeny Lebedev's Independent.
Ebola outbreak. We're all going to die trends on Twitter after virus reaches Spain.
Yes, we're all going to die. Never mind that what trends on Twitter isn't always the gospel truth. Still, according to Richard Desmond's Express, you still have time before you die.
Deadly Ebola virus could reach Britain in 3 weeks, say scientists.
In 3 weeks? That's ages. Probably longer than the estimated time for retaliation by ISIS on our major cities. But is Ebola a death sentence anyway? The Guardian Media Group's flagship daily thought so back in the summer.
Ebola cannot be cured, but West Africa's epidemic may have been preventable.
Hang on, forget about prevention for a minute. We know Ebola has killed more than the number who died in 9/11, but they are all from developing countries already ravaged by the IMF. As soon as people from the West get Ebola, many of them get cured thanks to a medicine called ZMapp, made by a Californian pharmaceutical company. ZMapp certainly sounds better than Viscount Rothermere's Daily Mail solution.
Ebola-killing robot destroys the virus in minutes.
Robots? It's more high-tech than the Barclay Brothers telegraph solution.
I'll fight off Ebola with bottles of Vimto. Liberian exorcist reveals secret weapon against deadly virus.
Maybe only colonial colonels reading the Tory House newspaper will remember the existence of Vimto, but the article does clearly set out by omission that the spread of Ebola couldn't be anything to do with the destruction of Liberia's healthcare infrastructure caused by recent CIA-backed civil wars. Talking of wars, Britain is spending millions flying out bombers from Cyprus. What's been going on there?
13,000 families below the poverty line.
So we can't alleviate Cypriot austerity, but we can afford wars. We can afford to send British troops to Sierra Leone to protect corporations, but we can't afford to distribute Ebola medication. In fact, there's something suspicious about which countries have been hit hardest by Ebola. The US may destabilize iron and rubber superpower Liberia, and the British destabilized diamond mining Sierra Leone, and the French destabilized aluminium superpower Guinea. Britain, France and America, countries that now seem to have billions to bomb Iraq. As the RAF rains down bombs from the skies of Iraq, the Tories are preparing for retaliation here in Britain. Already the government seems to realise that our war in Iraq will act as a recruitment sergeant for militant Wahhabism. Someone who knows about recruitment is award-winning filmmaker Rob Leach, director of My Brother the Islamist and My Brother the Terrorist. Rob Leach, welcome to Going Underground. For those who haven't seen these amazing films, just tell us a little bit about them.
Well, they're about, I guess, primarily they're about my stepbrother, Richard Dart, who converted to a sort of extreme brand of Islam in 2009. So the first film I made was kind of, it was about my journey, really, trying to reconnect with him and to kind of discover this strange new world which he'd become a part of. And then a few years later, he was actually arrested and convicted as a terrorist, and he's still in prison now. I made another film, which was really kind of bringing the story up to date, but also it was kind of, I wanted to sort of try and figure out and get it, I don't know, sort of a fresher perspective on what was going on. And,
it becomes more psychologically analytical maybe in the second film, but for those who haven't seen it also, it's a journey from Weymouth, Dorset coast, quintessential southern English upbringing to this kind of jihadism. One factor, one individual that keeps cropping up in the films is Anjem Chowdhury. Do you think it is individual cults, it's the power of the individual when it comes to cults like this? Or it is more deeper? Because you seem to change your mind through the films. At the beginning, it is this individual cult figure who appears all over the mainstream media, loving the publicity. Then it becomes more complicated.
I think it is more complicated. I think Anjem plays a significant role in that kind of radicalization process as a kind of facilitator, if you like. I think people are drawn to that kind of radical ideology themselves. I think Anjem just helps facilitate that and sort of plants the seeds, if you like. But the guys who kind of end up sort of becoming part of his groups, they're seeking that in the first place. They're seeking that kind of sense of empowerment and the identity which he gives them.
And there's some horrifying elements in it. And do you think if someone like the Home Secretary Theresa May was watching, she'd be going, oh, well, then the best way to do it would be to just jail Chowdhury or stop the internet. Perhaps one of the most horrific scenes I thought was when they start to film the new media videos, especially in the light of recent videos we're getting from ISIS, obviously. Do you think it's too simplistic, the way they're responding to it?
Possibly it is a bit too simplistic, but I think being able to tackle that is key. So somehow I think we need to be able to I don't know, combat that kind of what is propaganda, I guess. Whether that's...
But it's free speech.
It is free speech.
I mean, of course...
It's such a difficult thing. I remember in the first film, My Brother the Islamist, it's the anniversary of September 9/11, and we're outside the American Embassy.
You were shocked by flag burning.
Well,
flag burning isn't... I know.
But there was a remembrance ceremony in the park next to... So we're outside the American Embassy, and there was a ceremony about 100 feet away of, you know, people kind of mourning the death of everybody who died in September 9/11. And these, so Anjem Chowdhury and his brothers and my stepbrother are outside the front of the embassy, burning the American flag and spitting on it. And
maybe that's your Weymouth upbringing being so shocked about it, because a lot of people would go, well, Vietnam War, they used to burn the flag all the time. I mean, you're not proposing they should ban burning flags.
No, I think you should be able to burn a country's flag. What I kind of found really difficult about that was that it was clearly very, very insensitive, and it was meant to be insensitive, and it was done in front of the American embassy next to this ceremony, and the police were protecting them, and it just for someone who's there to kind of be in the middle of all that, it is a little bit kind of, you know, I think that comes at a kind of expense maybe in other parts of the world.
There it was obviously a hate. I mean, there could be hate crimes against people based on sexuality or religious affiliation. You, in the second film, go much more on the idea that it's not only this idea of the charismatic individual, it is the fertile ground that's laid. And of course, we are at war yet again. How do you think that's going to be spread around in terms of the leafleting by these sorts of groups?
Well, I mean, they've already started. I think maybe a month ago, there was a few reports in the media about groups, Al-Muhajirun, who obviously are banned, but members of kind of Anjem Chowdhury's group on Oxford Street handing out kind of pro-ISIS propaganda, which I found quite shocking. Which I don't know why I found it shocking.
No, I'd find that shocking.
But for them to do it,
propaganda.
For them to do it, you know, maybe that isn't so shocking, because one thing that they've always talked about is the Islamic State, and it's this utopia sort of solution to everything. That you know, it's the end, it's the big dream for them. So for them to sort of embrace the Islamic State in Syria, maybe that's not so surprising. But on one level, I was surprised, because it is so brutal and it is so un-Islamic that I kind of thought, well, surely you can see that. Surely you can see that this is Islamic.
Even you, because you articulate very powerfully how people just descend into this. What about then the persecution complex aspect to this? Do you think MI5, the PREVENT program, that adds to the persecution concept? I mean, obviously, if they start banning parties here in this country and taking passports away, and then start infiltrating people and surveilling people and banning Twitter, which seems to be the latest big idea, I mean, they're obviously going to be able to say they're quite right to have a persecution complex.
Well, yeah, and it's not hard to see how that persecution complex has come about. I mean, you mentioned the PREVENT strategy. When I spent time in East London Mosque, and they are a big victim of the PREVENT strategy, because according to the government, they're extremists. They may not be violent extremists, but they're non-violent extremists in the sense that they are seeking somehow to sort of overthrow democratic values.
In fairness to this government, they did scale down the PREVENT program, but presumably on your
They did, but I mean, the
films,
damage has already been done. You know, it's that.
But just finally, then, on the war itself, do you think it will be used as a recruitment? Now we're bombing Iraq again. Do you think it will be used as a recruitment tool?
It's another example of how the West, perceived to be oppressing and committing atrocities against Muslims. So of course it's going to be used in that way.
Rob Leach, thank you.
Thank you.
Great news for the Serious Fraud Office, which secured the UK's first guilty plea into LIBOR rigging last Friday, a major coup for the agency investigating the £200 trillion financial fraud scandal. So, how did Home Secretary Theresa May react to the news? Well, according to one financial paper, she now wants to abolish the SFO completely. She has previous on this. Last time, her attempts were blocked by then Justice Secretary Ken Clarke and then Attorney General Dominic Grieve. But now they've been sacked, was Ken Clarke sacked? Anyway, now both are gone. She wants the SFO to be run by the Home Office's National Crime Agency. It certainly has an interesting record as the self-styled British FBI. Its DG says that we should exchange our freedom for our security. And shortly before the NCA got its new name, 2 of its officers were suspended for unlawfully obtaining sensitive information before their charges had to be dismissed. The Home Office told Going Underground that reviewing the effectiveness of corruption cases is ongoing. But the Serious Fraud Office told us they didn't have any evidence that suggests breaking their teams up will somehow be more effective. Surely it couldn't be that Theresa May is happier carrying out mass surveillance than having successful SFO prosecutions for £200 trillion frauds like LIBOR. Show's over, but we're back on Monday when our head of state's former press secretary, let alone media manager to Prince Charles, tells us about how the royal family is used to sell arms to dictators and how prime ministers like Tony Blair sex up their influence on Buckingham Palace. Before then, you can drop us a line on Twitter at underground_RT, like our page on Facebook, or email us on goingunderground@rttv.co.uk. See you on Monday.